Hello, this is yet another discussion that we want to have on research with a focus on literature review. In this discussion, we want to focus on 5 items. The first item we want to look at is the meaning of literature and literature review, the importance of literature review, the objectives of literature review, the types of literature review, and then finally, the process involved in literature review. It's an important discussion because literature review is an important component of research whose understanding is essential and key in research. Welcome. Let us begin by looking at what literature is. Literature refers to collection of recorded work that may enhance our understanding in any given area of interest. And literature may be in form of written, audio recorded, or video recorded work. Literature include fictional and non-fictional books, articles, or other printed information, as well as audio and video recorded information on any particular subject or field of study that we are interested in. Maybe just to clarify one thing, fictional are basically stories that may reflect an actual issue or an imagined issue, but which again talks about issues that affect society, but in a creative way. They may include novels, plays, anthologies, and other work. Although they may look or sound as creative work, the creative work speaks about issues that affect our society. And that is why in some studies such as literature, fictional work is considered an important source of literature. Literature come in many types. For instance, we have what we call primary literature. Primary literature basically refers to the original studies that have been undertaken by researchers and whose information is obtained through the administration of questionnaires, interviews, direct observations, and use of statistical records of actual practices or policies that are found either at organizational, governmental, or non-governmental institutions. Literature, in terms of primary literature, there are basically sources that have been authored by researchers and they contain data in original form. Primary sources are usually published in peer-reviewed journals, but may also include conference papers, preprints, or preliminary reports. All these constitute what we call primary literature. In short, primary literature basically refers to information or literature that is directly obtained from empirical studies by researchers. Such literature is obtained from what we call primary respondents. Another type of literature is called secondary literature. And secondary literature basically consists of interpretations and evaluations which are derived from primary sources. These include articles such as those that have been obtained or arrived at through meta-analysis or systematic reviews, as well as reference works. They are mainly produced by professionals and scholars who review existing primary literature and synthesize them and then establish certain patterns or trends that are in them. Then they come up with a synthesized form of literature which is presented as scholarly work. It is also an important it's also an important type of literature that at any level of research we are also required to go through because they are also capable of enhancing understanding about any given area that you may be interested in as researchers or scholars. Another type of literature is called tertiary literature. Tertiary literature basically consists of literature that has been distilled or synthesized from a collection of both primary and secondary sources. They include what we find in textbooks, in encyclopedia, in articles, in guidebooks, or in handbooks that have been offered by institutions or organizations to streamline procedures, policies, and administrative issues in such institutions or organizations. Tertiary literature provides an overview of key research findings and also an introduction to principles and practices within any given discipline. In short, when you talk about primary literature, we basically mean literature that has been synthesized, distilled, and published based on primary and secondary sources of information that we have already discussed. Another important type of literature that we also come across in our studies is what we call grey literature. Grey literature basically refers to the material that is either unpublished or published in non-commercial form. In other words, such materials are not sold at a profit. If at all there are certain charges to be levied on them, they are basically meant to facilitate the production and maintenance of such material. They include theses and dissertations that students at various levels of learning are required to produce as part of their learning and as part of their examination at any given level of learning. They also include government reports, such as census reports, government surveys, among others. They also include fact sheets as well as preprint articles. It is what we call grey literature. In other words, grey literature basically is literature or information that is provided by institutions and which is meant to educate general public, scholars, and academicians on any given area. Grey literature normally is not evaluated and peer-reviewed. In other words, they are not literature that is critically examined and assessed by scholars in any particular field of study. They include preprints, preliminary progress, as well as advanced reports. They also include institutional, internal, technical, as well as statistical reports, market research reports, reports of commissions, as well as study groups. For instance, if you were to take the BBI report, the Building Bridges Initiative report, that report will be considered as grey literature. A document like the Constitution of Kenya will be considered as grey literature, as well as publications that come in form of government legislations as well as government policies. All these are what we call grey literature. Other forms of grey literature are papers from conference proceedings, technical specifications and standards, as well as technical and commercial documentations. They all are part of grey literature. Although it constitutes part of the broader body that we call literature, scholars are generally advised not to rely so much on grey literature due to the fact that they have not been subjected to critical review by professionals or scholars within a given discipline, and therefore they are not highly valued as peer-reviewed articles or peer-reviewed documents, because the scientific community have not had a chance to critique, to compare what is there, and to understand its validity and reliability. Documents, for instance, that are produced by institutions such as World Bank, WHO, IMF, and all those other institutions, they constitute what is called grey literature. They're important in understanding, in enhancing understanding and deepening our knowledge about certain areas. But again, like I said earlier, they are advised as professionals to use them very, very caringly. So, up to where we have reached, we have attempted to understand what literature is, as well as the various types of literature. At this point now, we want to turn to what is meant by literature review. Literature review is basically a survey of scholarly sources, such as what is in books, what is in journal articles, what is in thesis, and which we consider as being related to our areas of interest as researchers. So if you want to undertake a given study, you are normally encouraged to go through a valuable literature that exists in your area of study. So that process in which we look at what has been done and what has not been done in our area of study, that entire process is what we call literature review. It involves the search and evaluation of the available literature in a given subject or chosen topical area or an area of interest. But we can also look at literature review simply as a comprehensive summary of previous research on a given topic. For instance, assuming we're interested at understanding issues about violence among young people, then, or drug abuse among young people, or something like alcoholism among young people, then we are required as researchers to spare sufficient time to go through previous studies that have been done on youth involvement in violence or youth involvement in drugs and substance abuse. So this critical evaluation of what has been done in an area that we are interested in taking our study is what we call literature review. The review should enumerate, should describe, should summarize, and should objectively evaluate the methodologies and findings of previous studies. In other words, what methods did previous studies employ, in undertaking the studies that they did. In addition, what were the findings that those studies found in any given area? So that entire process is what in the academic cycle or in research we call literature review. Why is it important for researchers to undertake literature review? One is that literature review provides an overview of current knowledge, and this allows us to identify the theories that have been used by previous studies, the methods that have been employed by the studies, but ultimately the most important aspect is the gaps that exist in research. In other words, what is it that has been done by previous researchers and what is it that has not been done? So that which has not been done might be the basis in which we develop our interest in undertaking the research so that we fill the gap that exists in knowledge. The other important research view is that it gives researchers the chance to demonstrate familiarity with the research problem and the scholarly context. For instance, we may have a research problem that we think we need to undertake a research to resolve, because a research problem simply is a puzzle that a researcher seeks to resolve. In that case, therefore, we undertake research review so that we demonstrate our understanding, deep understanding about the issue that we seek to address through research. But more importantly, it also enables us to understand the context under which previous areas that appear similar or that fall within the broader area that we have developed an interest in taking research. So there we'll then understand the context under which previous studies have been done. For instance, drug abuse is a phenomenon that affects so many people in society, several demographics in society. So we might be interested in understanding what was the context of previous studies with regard to, say, drug abuse. Perhaps previous studies looked at drug abuse among the youth, among the elderly. And therefore, when we look at that, we then say that the context under which previous studies have been done was on the youth and the elderly. Then we say, then a researcher might look at it and say that it might also be interesting to understand whether persons with disability also engage in drug abuse. And therefore, your next study will now be understanding drug abuse in the context of persons with disability. Therefore, research review enables us to understand the subjects, the populations, and the circumstances under which previous studies were done, and that will enable us to know what other circumstances or other contexts have previous studies not been done under. And that now can be the basis upon which we develop our research problem. Another importance of research, or rather of literature review, is that it offers us an opportunity to understand and integrate theories and methodologies used in previous studies, and also their relevance and applicability in an area that we have developed an interest in. In other words, when we undertake literature review, we are able to know which theories have been used by previous studies, which methodologies have been used in previous studies, how strong, how relevant were those theories, what kind of results did the various methodologies that were used yield, and therefore can we adopt those methodologies or can we improve on those methodologies? Are there weaknesses that we have found with the previous methodologies in any given area of research? that we think that in our next study, we either need to modify those methodologies or we need to use more than one methodology to enhance the kind of results or findings that we are likely to get. The last importance of literature review is that it enables researchers to establish knowledge gap left by previous studies, which can form the basis and justification of future studies. I think this one I have explained much in the other explanations that I've given with regard to the importance of research, and therefore much of what is there I have already provided some background information and understanding about. What are the objectives of literature review? One is to survey the available literature in an area of interest. Simply go through the literature that exists in your area of interest. Maybe you want to understand why the youth are getting involved in crime. So read any information that's available about youth involvement in crime. That is what we call a survey. The other objective is to synthesize and provide a summary of literature in an area of interest. Synthesis means you bring different authors, and those different authors, if authors agree in particular findings on any issue around literature, then you put authors that agree on a given issue together, and then juxtapose them against those that have found contrary findings to what the others have given. That's what we call synthesis. Then after that, you provide a summary of the various authors and the kind of findings the study that were undertaken have yielded. Number 3 is to critically analyze the information gathered by identifying gaps in current body of knowledge, therefore showing areas that require further research. What this means is that when you are carrying out literature review, we are also concerned about areas that previous studies have not covered. Now, those areas where previous studies have not covered, it becomes the gap that as current researchers we might be interested in understanding, so that those areas that previous studies have not looked at might now form the basis upon which the current study or further studies are based on. For instance, assuming you are looking at drug abuse, and when you read literature, you find that there are literature that have talked about causes of drug abuse. There are literature that have talked about rehabilitation. But then, when you go further, you don't find literature that's talking about relapse. That say out of 10 people who have undergone rehabilitation, say 7 are relapsing and therefore resuming drug addiction behavior. Then now say, with regard to drug abuse, studies exist on causes and studies exist on rehabilitation, but there are no studies on relapse. However, it has been pointed out that a significant proportion of those who have undergone rehabilitation, they relapse, meaning they go back to addiction behavior. Therefore, you say why people go back to addiction behavior is an area that previous studies have not looked at. That therefore becomes the gap that your study feels, or as a researcher you feel, is an area that requires further research. So the further research that this area that now require further research now becomes the basis of the research problem, and therefore you set out to understand factors contributing to relapse. That therefore becomes your area of interest. The last objective literature review is to present information gathered from literature in an organized manner. There must be an element of organization so that as a researcher, you should show your readers the information that flows. Where are authors agreeing? Where are authors disagreeing? Why is it that there are areas of an agreement, then there are areas of disagreement? Is it based on the context of the study? Is it based on the methodologies that were used? Or is it based on the population? Or a historical epoch? Is it based on that? That therefore can give you an idea as to why probably certain differences exist with regard to the research findings. Let's now turn our attention to types of literature review. There are of course various types of literature review that we want to look at. The first one is called narrative review. Narrative review, we are basically concerned about understanding the general knowledge about a given area of interest. For instance, if we want to study, say, why school-going children in high school are engaging in arson. Of course, recently Kenya has experienced so many things with arson, and therefore we are concerned about factors contributing to rising cases of arson in Kenya's secondary schools. Then, in terms of narrative literature review, we are going to look at four principal areas. One is what we call general literature review. The other one is theoretical review. Then we have methodological review. And then the last one, the historical review. In general literature review, our focus will be understanding arson generally. That is, cases of arson in the world, in schools, that are attributable to learners. So we look at the state of arson in secondary schools, say in Europe, in America, in Asia, in Africa, in South Africa, Southern Africa rather, and then in Kenya. That way, it will enable us to understand the general status of arson in secondary schools. That is what we call general literature review. Then we will look at each of our objectives and see what is it that has been done around the kind of objectives that our study one focus on with regard to arson. So in general literature review, the major focus is how has arson been discussed in literature from different parts of the world by different authors. The main purpose of the general literature review is to enable us gather knowledge or information that we can use to build our background of the study. Then we have what we call the theoretical view. In theoretical view, we are basically focusing on the various theories that previous studies have adopted with regard to studies around arson. It may not necessarily be arson in secondary schools, but arson in general. So that here we are focusing on how have the previous researchers applied the various propositions in those theories in explaining the relationship between various study variables. So here we are basically looking at the theories that previous studies adopted and how they have been used to explain various issues that those studies sought to establish. Then we have what we call methodological review. In methodological review, we are basically looking at the various methodologies that previous researchers have adopted. For instance, what are some of the sampling methods they have used, data collection methods they have used, and even ethical issues they have observed in their previous studies. What are their strengths and what are their weaknesses? What can we learn from these methodologies, and how can we use those methodologies and adopt them in our studies, bearing in mind that they have certain strengths and weaknesses. That way, we are now able to know which methodologies have been used and their relevance in understanding the population of study in any given context. Then we have what we call the historical literature review. In historical literature review, the focus largely is on understanding how a concept has changed over the years. For instance, if we want to focus on arson in high school, how has the word arson evolved? How was it used in the past? Has the meaning changed, and in what context has it been used? That way, we are now able to understand an issue with regards to the time changes that it has undergone and whether or not its meaning has remained the same or the meaning has changed over the years. Systematic review is a method in which a body of literature is aggregated, reviewed, and then assessed. We undertake systematic review so as to establish conflicting or coincidental findings with a view to identify themes that require further investigation. In this method, it is particularly useful to integrate the information of a group of studies investigating the same phenomena and then focus on a specific empirical question that can guide us in establishing whether findings on those empirical investigations are similar or conflicting. For instance, we may be concerned about the influence of parental background on a child's incidences of drug abuse, so that we are concerned about whether children who are brought up by both parents are better in terms of drug abuse and substance compared to their counterparts that are brought up by single parents. In other words, we are asking ourselves, are we likely to find fewer cases of drug abuse among children who have both parents and higher cases of drug abuse among children who do not have either both or one parent? So that at the end of the day, we are able to say that if you are brought up by both parents, you are likely to have lesser cases or more cases of drug abuse compared to your counterparts that either have one or both parents absent in their lives. So that in systematic review, we are going to put together studies that have looked at children with both parents and their status of drug abuse. Again, we put together studies that looked at children with either one parent or none of their parents were alive, and again their status of drug abuse. So that at the end of the day, we want to see whether all studies where children have both parents have found or have yielded similar results or conflicting results. Same thing we are going to do for children with one or none of the parents being alive. Again, to see whether the findings of those studies have yielded similar or contrasting findings. So that we are now able to aggregate, put together this information, and now argue that either studies have not been conclusive with regards to the influence of parental background on the status of children's drug abuse, and then argue further that there is need, because of these contradictory findings or incomplete findings, for more studies to be undertaken in that particular area. The other type of literature review is called meta-analysis. In meta-analysis, it is a valid, objective, and scientific method of analyzing and combining different results. It's largely seen as a statistical procedure for combining numerical data from multiple and separate studies. The conclusions that are produced by meta-analysis are considered to be statistically stronger than the analysis of any single study due to the increased numbers of subjects, greater diversity among subjects, or accumulated effects and results. In simple terms, when we talk about meta-analysis as a type of literature review, we are basically talking about looking at different studies in a more detailed manner and then combining the findings of those studies to see whether there are differences or similarities in their findings. And it is not merely establishing the differences or similarities in findings, but also looking at the various methodologies that have been applied and seeing whether, if certain methodologies are used on the same study, is it possible to yield a different or the same result. That way, with time, we are then able to conclude that the use of particular methodologies are more suitable in studies of particular nature because of the likelihood of producing better results, better or detailed results. For instance, if we are to collect data through, say, questionnaires, another study collects the same study but done by a different researcher, collects data through, say, interviews, are we likely to get the same results when different methods are used? So that we are now able to say that regardless of the method used, results are likely to be the same, or different methods are likely to yield different results. That way, we are now able to recommend which methods of data collection are better with regard to data, with regard to particular sets of studies. So that in meta-analysis, we are now combining and synthesizing different studies, the methodologies, and the results that have been obtained, and then putting together those studies as now separate studies. In other words, we combine different studies and their findings and compile them into a new set of studies that now a future researcher or a scholar can now look at it and say that secondary studies that looked at previous studies were able to put together different approaches and the various results that they produced. And it is discernible from those results that if you employ particular methodologies, you are likely to get better results or more detailed results than when other methodologies are used. Let's then look at the process of literature review. Literature review has certain processes or stages that we are required to follow if we are to have an effective literature review. The first step in literature review is we select a research problem. So that we are required to select a research problem that meets the criteria of a good research problem. In our previous lectures, we had established the qualities of a good research problem, and therefore at this stage, I just want to refer you to those lectures where we discussed the research problem, how we get a research problem, as well as what makes a research problem a good research problem. Once you have selected a good research problem, you are then meant to establish the research objectives and research questions that are in sync with the research problems and also meet the other criteria for qualities of good research objectives. Of course, a research problem, once you have it, you must then develop the research objectives. Again, I want to refer you to previous lectures where we talked about objectives, how we develop objectives, and the qualities of good objectives. The other issue that you are required to undertake in step 1 is to define the scope or thematic issues that you intend to examine in each of the research objectives. We stated and discussed this again in our previous lectures, and we said that each research objective must have independent and dependent variables, and we agreed that each of the independent variables, we divide it into smaller thematic issues which we call descriptive variables. So it is those descriptive variables that you now use to guide you in your search for appropriate information that you need to put down in form of literature. In step 2, you identify the most relevant sources of literature. Again, we had earlier on discussed where we obtain our literature, but just for purposes of reminding us, we can get literature from books, from journals, from internet sites, from dissertations, conference papers, government, institution, and industry reports. We, however, must ensure that the information that we want to use as literature are obtained from sources that are scholarly permitted by our respective fields of study. So here we simply identify scholarly materials and documents that we think contain useful information and ideas about the research problem that we intend to tackle in our study. But beyond the sources of literature that I've mentioned above, we also advised to also get information from the reference sources, such as dictionaries, such as encyclopedia, and other information that are considered authority, the Constitution, the Bible, and others. These sources are important in helping us define or explain certain terminologies that we intend to use in our studies. Remember, also earlier on we stated that we are required to define certain concepts in a way in which we want them understood in our study. So reference sources such as dictionaries, the Bible, the Constitution, the encyclopedia, and others can be of help when we now want to define certain terms to ensure that the way they understood is the way we wish them to be understood in our studies. In step 3, you are now required to search and refine the literature. First, determine the scope of the literature. Search, for instance, demographics, the time period, the study type, the geographic region, among others, to reduce the number of articles to be reviewed. If we consider the example that I gave earlier, why maybe we're interested in understanding drug abuse among college-going students. Then we have to define our demographics. Demographics here would mean, for instance, the age. What is the age of the college-going students? Say 18 to say 30. So we are going to define our research. We are going to source for literature for drug abuse among people aged 18 to 30. Or maybe we want to look at it in terms of gender. So again, we say drug abuse among women aged 18 to 30. What is the time period? Remember again, we say that sometimes you are required to review most recent literature, because sometimes recent findings may challenge the findings of previous studies, and therefore you also need to keep abreast with the most recent literature on any given field. So that you may say, we want to focus on literature that talks about drug abuse among the age group of 18 to 30, but studies that say were done after the year 2000. That now becomes the time period. Type study and even geographic region. Maybe those that were done in Europe, those that were done in Asia, in America, in Africa. That one, if you do so, it's going to help you in reducing the number of articles that you need to review. Otherwise, if you look at it generally, it can be quite cumbersome, and you might get so much information that may face difficulties in terms of refining, then coming up with a clear focus. The other thing that you do is you identify key variables in each study objective to inform the search to the literature. This is now where we talk about descriptive variables, but beyond that, we also talk about descriptive variables. So those descriptive variables and independent variables, they help you in focusing on specific types of literature that can guide you in terms of understanding the issues that you intend to study in your research. Then it's advisable that you study the more recent material and work backwards, as this allows you to acquaint yourself with the recent revelations in an area of interest. In other words, look for the most recent literature, then you move forward, so that you want to see are findings the same, or have previous studies contradicted, findings of previous studies contradicting those ones, the previous ones. That is still important, so that you are now able to see whether there have been changes in terms of findings, or findings have been affirmed by recent studies. Then assess whether available literature in the area of interest is adequate, or there is need for a change of research problem. Of course, if you come up with a research problem where literature is so hard to find, sometimes you may be advised that you may need to change your research problem, because there are studies that available literature can guide you in terms of which direction you proceed with. But if it's an area that there is totally nothing to talk about, then it might give you some difficulties in terms of building the background for your study, and also in terms of exposing the gaps that previous studies have left and which your study is coming in to fill. So if it is not possible at all to get adequate literature to enhance, that can enhance your understanding of that area, then sometimes you're advised to abandon that research problem and then come up with another one where literature is available. Step 4, read, summarize, and describe each source of information, noting the findings, while also noting points of departure among the authors. And also try to extract the unique concepts in the literature that are central to your understanding of the topic. You also expect to note the theories and methodologies used in different studies, their adequacy in addressing the key issues in your study. Then take note of the most important and critical information from each of the sources of literature. For instance, consider who was the author, when was the work published, what was being studied, in other, what was the research problem, what methodologies were used, what were the findings, where was the study done, what was the population of the study. This one, it is important because if, say, a study was done in Europe, focusing on the youth, and it yielded a particular finding, it is possible that the findings might obtain in Africa or not, because of the circumstances, the socio-cultural circumstances of a youth in Africa may not be the same as that of a youth in the developed world. So it's always important that you put these studies into the right context, so that somebody now is able, why, despite certain studies having been done elsewhere, you still feel that you need to do them, say, in Kenya. If you do that, then it gives an opportunity to expose the gaps. It gives an opportunity to justify why those studies, despite them having been done elsewhere, it is still important for similar studies or related studies to be done in a place like Kenya or Africa generally. That's why it's important that you read, you summarize, and you take note of important issues about those studies, because they then give you an opportunity to compare and contrast why your study needs to be done despite related studies having been done elsewhere. In step 5, you are required to read and analyze the literature. In doing this, there are certain questions that should guide you. One, who did the research? When and where was the study conducted? Which theories, methodologies were used, and how sound are they in terms of what you want to do? And then, what were the findings of the studies? These are important guidelines that you now need to employ at step 5, because then they are the guidelines that you use to now analyze and critique the literature. If you do this, then it gives you a better idea about where the study was done, who did the study, the methodologies and the theories that were done, so that you are now able to see whether you need to employ different theories or adopt previous theories, employ different methodologies or adopt similar methodologies that have been used by previous studies, and whether or not they may be relevant and suitable for the study that you intend to undertake. They are quite important. In step 6, you now write the review. That is, present the literature showing the author, here when the work was published, what the study was about, the methodology used, and the findings of the study. That's normally the format that you are required to follow when you're now writing down your literature, when you're now presenting your literature. But you're also required to organize literature by theme to ensure that all the sources with a similar focus are put together. And this one makes it easier for the readers or for you as a researcher to understand the differences in perspectives. If, for instance, you are looking at economic causes of drug abuse, then all literature talking about economic cause of drug abuse are put together. If you look at the social cause of drug abuse, again, you are required to put all the literature around the same thing together. That one, it is easier now to know and follow up and see the differences and similarities in the findings. You also require to present literature from the same region together. If it is Europe, put it together. America, put it together. Asia, put it together. Africa, put it together. And let it have that logical flow, so that people are now, or your reader, or you yourself as the researcher, you are now able to see whether studies that have been done in different parts of the world have similar findings or difference, and possibly why, what would account for those differences in findings. Then you also require to discuss the literature showing the findings, how it was the proposed study, and what the proposed study intends to do over and above existing literature. In other words, you are required now to put your literature study, your literature down and discuss them. Because literature is not merely putting things together. No, it's about discussing them. So that you are able to show the findings of the previous studies was this. And again move further and say that these studies are important to what I want to study in this manner. But now go ahead and say, given the type of study that has been done, ABCD has been done, however, this other aspect has not been done. And it is this aspect that has not been done that my study intends to cover. That way now, you are now giving the reader the place of your study. Then lastly, you also need to ensure that a good RLV is not simply a summary of previous studies, but it is one that shows signs of synthesis, evidence of analytical thinking, and connections between existing literature and the current study. That's basically what I have just explained. So that you are not merely presenting the information. No, you are required to go further, synthesize, in other words, various studies that have been done on a given area and that have found similar findings to them together. Then you also require to think analytically, so that somebody reading the literature review section is able to know that this researcher had done a lot of analytical thinking and was able to bring out certain information that mere reading of literature probably might have not exposed. So you are required to think deeply when you are reading literature to ensure that you extract and bring out the gaps that existing studies have not covered.